24th of February, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin announces the invasion of Ukraine, launching the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II. As Russian airstrikes pounded Ukrainian cities, Western leaders tried to cripple the Russian war machine with sweeping sanctions. They cut Russian banks out of the global financial system, banned the sale of key goods, and sought to eliminate their purchases of Russian oil and gas. Policymakers and analysts have predicted economic meltdown and a quick end to the war. But they were wrong. Fast forward 2 years, and the much hoped for collapse never came. In fact, Russia was booming, while Europe was in disarray. However, the good times might not last. The Russian central bank now forecasts GDP growth of 1.5% this year, versus a much stronger 4.3% in 2024. So what is it? Is Russia red hot, or just in the red? This is Russia, Putin's facade. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia struggled to come to grips with its declining global importance. Previously the global number 2, it had shriveled into another failed example in the communist experiment. Gorbachev had thought that moving past the closed, centrally planned Iron Curtain would be well worth it. He believed it could start a new chapter in Russia's history, where they would participate more openly in global trade and build a prosperous, modern society. But it didn't turn out like that. Under a policy of shock therapy, launched by President Boris Yeltsin, Russia liberalized its economy almost overnight. The results were disastrous. Russia's industrial output collapsed, and GDP contracted by 50% throughout the 90s. Many of the country's largest enterprises fell into the control of a small group of wealthy, politically connected oligarchs. It was a brutal decade. Living standards deteriorated significantly, and crime surged. The alcoholic, aging President Yeltsin stood down in 1999, leaving behind a poor and brittle country. Enter a new character, Yeltsin's chosen successor, Vladimir Putin. After a decade of decline, Putin wanted to put the country back on its feet. Luckily for him, he was in the right place at the right time. Russia had huge reserves of oil and gas, and global prices were surging. Between 1998 and 2008, oil prices increased fivefold, and Russian GDP per capita doubled. These natural resource reserves remain the bedrock of the country's economy. They accounted for nearly 20% of all GDP in the run-up to the invasion, 30% of the budget, and 50% of all exports. Russia has the largest natural gas reserves in the world, the second largest coal reserves, tons of uranium, nickel, gold, diamond, and more. These resources enabled Russia to become the world's 11th largest economy in nominal terms, and the 4th largest in purchasing power parity terms prior to the invasion. And this is critical, because these resources not only support Russia's economy, but more importantly, their military ambitions. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia hoped that NATO would either cease to exist, or that they would be invited to join. Neither happened. Given this, Russia continued to invest heavily in both their military and trade relations with the EU. In particular, Russia signed long-term deals to supply gas to Europe, comprising nearly 45% of all natural gas imports prior to 2022. By creating these economic entanglements, the hope was that skin in the game would deter retaliation for Russian war efforts. After the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was able to fund its military efforts with a steady supply of recurring cash flows from Europe. Moreover, in 2024, Russia exported 21.9 billion euros of fossil fuels to the EU, surpassing the 18.7 billion euros of aid provided to Ukraine in the same year. And global exports of fossil fuels are nearly identical to pre-war levels. Despite sanctions and efforts to cut off Russian energy sales, Russia still accounts for 19% of EU natural gas imports. Putin was right. The EU's need for Russian energy outweighed their revulsion at his invasion. And even though the world introduced sanctions to cripple Russia's economy, it was seemingly booming. From 2022 to 2024, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6%, nearly 7 times the growth of the Eurozone of 0.5%. Even Western media influencers showcase the strength of Russia, highlighting their safe streets, incredible grocery stores, and bustling society. Putin was winning the domestic political narrative and keeping Russia wealthy and strong against a hostile outside world. But is that actually true? These numbers, although rosy, don't paint the full picture. Let's reframe this. When Putin sent troops into Ukraine, he thought it would be short and decisive. Their goals were simple: remove President Zelensky and the rest of the country's pro-Western government and replace it with a pro-Moscow regime that would put Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence and prevent Ukraine from joining the EU and NATO. In fact, he thought his special military operation would be so effective that Russian troops even brought uniforms so they could hold a parade on the streets of Kyiv to celebrate their victory. And he had done this before. In 2008, he sent troops into another former Soviet republic, Georgia, and successfully took control of large towns and built separatist, Moscow-backed governments. The government in Tbilisi was powerless to respond, and the world, for the most part, looked the other way. In 2014, he even sent troops into occupied Crimea, a province in southern Ukraine, and took control of the region without serious international pushback. And the result? Russia walked away untouched. 4 years later, it was hosting the World Cup. But this time was different. Unlike in Georgia, the Ukrainian defense was ferocious. Hundreds of Russian tanks were destroyed on the road to Kyiv, and Russian troops found themselves bogged down in trenches in eastern Ukraine, hiding from the buzzing drones overhead. And unlike in 2008, the West responded decisively, rolling out aggressive sanctions to cut Russia out of the global economy. Putin was forced to dig in for a long war in Ukraine, and he needed to pull out all the stops to keep his economy alive. First, Russia's central bank stepped in to stop the collapse of the ruble, hiked its policy rate up to 20% immediately after the invasion, which encouraged investors to hold the currency and reversed its collapse. And more importantly, the government pumped cash into the economy to fund the war effort, and Russia's military-industrial complex roared into action. Military spending surged by 64% in the first year of the war, and has kept climbing since. Total government expenditure is up by more than 50% since the start of the war. The government has also directed banks to lend to the defense and industrial sectors at preferential rates. Corporate debt in Russia has increased by 71% since mid-2022. Factories ramped up their production and expanded their facilities to make bullets, shells, tank tracks, you name it. That in turn boosted the economy. If any country did what Russia did, it would lead to an economic boom. Which begs the question, why don't they? Russia's economy has been on war-induced steroids for the past 3 years, but now it looks like the cracks might just be starting to show. For starters, those government policies may have boosted GDP and propped up the economy, but they also lit the fuse on runaway inflation. In 2024, inflation hit 9.5%. Russia found itself in a wage price spiral. Labour shortages and runaway government spending led to higher wages, which led to higher prices, which led workers to demand even higher wages, and so on. Real wages were up 9% last year, as factories battled with the military for access to workers, hundreds of thousands of whom were sent to the front lines in Ukraine. The Russian economy was overheating. This forced the central bank to take action. It hiked interest rates again, this time all the way up to 22% to control the inflation. For context, the European Central Bank has a policy rate of 2%, whilst China's loan prime rate is around 3 to 3.5%. These sky-high interest rates have helped to keep a lid on inflation and prop up the value of the ruble, but they have slammed the brakes on the rest of the economy. The war has pulled capital and labour away from the civilian economy and into the military-industrial complex. On top of that, as many as 1 million of Russia's most productive and qualified younger workers, such as those in the tech sector, have left the economy since the war started. According to the Russian government-affiliated Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, the civilian economy is actually heading towards recession. Industrial output outside the defense sector and related industry has fallen by 1.6% in the first quarter of this year. Sanctions have killed off export demand for non-energy products. High interest rates stop people and companies from borrowing and investing. And with the government throwing money at defense and skilled labor, businesses are stuck paying higher wages, shrinking their margins even further. The war machine is running at maximum capacity with little room for growth, but the civilian economy is going backwards. For example, this chart from the Bank of Finland shows that Russia's production of motor vehicles and household appliances fell by around 30% between 2021 and 2024, whilst other industries have all seen sharp falls. The takeaway is clear. Russia is throwing all the men and money at its disposal at the war effort. And in the rest of the economy, it's going into a deep freeze. Real quick, we started a Discord community. We can submit ideas, ask us questions, or even debate us. It's free, and you can find the link in the description. Now, back to the video. Now, you might argue, who cares? Russia has tons of natural resources and plenty of reliable buyers. And you'd be largely correct. Surging oil and gas revenues have helped keep the economy humming along despite sanctions. For a start, as mentioned, even some of the loudest critics of Putin's invasion found themselves unable to wean themselves off Russian oil and gas entirely. But more importantly, Russia has managed to work around sanctions and price caps to find plenty of willing buyers for its discounted oil and gas, most notably in India and China. Indian imports of Russian crude have grown tenfold since the start of the war, and the country is now the largest buyer of Russian oil. Russia is also the largest source of crude for China, which bought 108.5 million tons of it in 2024. This, combined with a related surge in global energy prices, led Russian fossil fuel export revenues to soar by 34% in the first year of the war, to a total of $407 billion. These oil and gas revenues have been and remain a vital lifeline for the Kremlin. As long as the oil keeps pumping, the country can keep moving. But what if oil prices fall? That's a big problem, especially when the energy sector accounts for 20% of GDP and 30% of federal government revenues. The Russian government sets its budget each year based on a forecast for the prices of oil and gas. This year, they forecast a fiscal deficit of around 1% of GDP, based on the assumption that Urals crude, the main Russian blend, would trade at around $70 per barrel. But with the slump in global prices, Urals prices are likely to fall to around $55 per barrel. That would mean that the fiscal deficit would more than double. Now, we should of course point out that at the time of writing, Israel's strikes on Iran have pushed oil prices up, but the global macroeconomic and oil supply trend has nonetheless been down for most of this year. At the same time, gas exports are also falling. In January, they shut off the last direct gas pipeline to Europe, which will cost them around $4.5 billion per year in lost sales. Meanwhile, the proposed Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, which is meant to sell even more gas from Siberia to China, has made next to zero progress. Russia won't go bankrupt overnight. The country's national wealth fund still has the firepower to step in and fund the shortfall in oil and gas revenues. But this will make it more difficult for the state to reverse the slowdown that's already underway in the rest of the economy. But even the national wealth fund has its problems. The liquid portion of the fund has fallen to around $36.4 billion, the lowest level since 2019. Some economists are predicting that if current trends persist, the national wealth fund's liquid assets will deplete by next year. No national wealth fund means that Russia won't be able to cover their federal deficit and their debt obligations. Put simply, the Kremlin's money machine is running low on gas. The inevitable question you might ask is, what does this mean for Putin and how will it change the war in Ukraine? In the short term, it won't change much. Moscow has the tools and resources to survive, and Putin remains focused on winning the war in Ukraine at almost any cost. So while Russia's growth may slow this year, balanced economic growth just isn't his priority. But in the long term, Russia faces a grim future. Until now, a growing economy has allowed Putin to keep the show on the road. The Russian people's support for the war has in large part been built on the fact that, so far, the economy has been doing okay and their salaries have gotten better. A protracted slowdown threatens to change this. And for Putin, who has built his image and public approval on stability and rising living standards, the facade is finally starting to crumble. Subscribe to 2 and 20 for more on economics and politics. Thank you for watching.